So, global recession is coming and there's no escape. The economy today seems to be strong, right? If we look at all the official metrics, everything looks good. US GDP is at 4.9%, but this major economic collapse is telling us global demand is dying. We know Europe is in a recession, but now the world's third largest economy is in deep trouble. The dominoes, they're just starting to line up, and America won't escape the carnage no matter how much Joe Biden spends. In our lead story today, Japan's economy shrinks, backing BOJ and government stimulus case. Japan has returned to contraction, and the much anticipated economic recovery is now just a fairy tale. And we have said this 1,000 times before. Printing money doesn't solve the situation. It just destroys your currency and eventually your entire economy. Japan's GDP for Q3 has crashed by a dramatic 2.1%. Q1 and Q2's growth looked spectacular at over 3% each, but realize what Japan was doing. They were printing up tons of money to prop up the economy. The Bank of Japan has been suppressing bond yields for the longest time. The 10-year Japanese bond is well under 1% today, so borrowing costs shouldn't be a problem in Japan. And if we compare the inflation rates between other G7 countries like the US and the UK, Japan's inflation is still the lowest of the lot. So what is going on? The Japanese economy should be exploding, not contracting. And that's because Japan and the rest of the world is suffering from a massive demand problem. Consumer spending is collapsing. The consequence of all this massive money printing is destroying Japan's currency. So Japan is caught in a deadly doom loop, right, where the yen is collapsing to hell, but that isn't helping their exports. A common pushback we keep hearing is that a weak currency is great for exports. It makes them cheaper. But the yen is already at a 25-year low. It has collapsed over 20% since Powell started hiking rates to the moon. Japan shouldn't be one step towards recession. Their GDP figures should be exploding higher and higher. But looking at the figures of Japanese exports, we can observe a real crisis unfolding. It's not just a crisis for Japan, but a horror story for global demand. We can see Japan's exports are slowing down dramatically. The value of export growth has been dropping like a rock ever since the end of last year. Japanese products aren't any worse than things made in Germany or Europe. People aren't buying those because they are too expensive. But if the yen is down 25%, Japanese exports should be flying to the moon because things are much cheaper now. Countries can import more for less from Japan. But this just isn't happening. The data paints a real story of doom and gloom for the world economy. Every country is now absorbing the effects of higher interest rates, which is destroying demand. And this is where things get very dangerous for Japan and by extension, the world as well. The Bank of Japan has to choose between destroying local demand the slow way or collapsing demand in an instant. Japan has approved a $113 billion stimulus package to fight inflation, which is ridiculous because it's simply injecting more money to the system. Inflation will soar back up and then the BOJ will have a choice. Do they hike rates and collapse the economy in a hurry? Or do they allow inflation to bleed the consumer into the underworld? And if they do nothing, the yen is going to keep crashing down to hell, which destroys the buying power of the Japanese people. So, whether you're in the US, China, or Europe, you can kiss goodbye to the Japanese consumer. This chart shows us the trend of Japanese imports. Japanese imports have fallen into negative for the first time in April this year, and the situation is getting worse and worse with each passing month. This is undeniable proof that demand from the third largest economy is contracting. This is extremely bad for Japan because they are caught in a doom loop cycle. According to economists, gloomy outlooks for China, the US, and other major trading partners will hit exports and continue to deter business spending. Japan is essentially on recession watch now. So we have Europe on the brink of a collapse. Japan's just one negative quarter away from another recession. And how about China? The IMF has upgraded China's economy. They forecast a growth of 5.4% this year and 4.6% in 2024. But that won't stop the rest of the world from falling to a recession. China can't save the global economy because it's their own domestic consumption that's propping up Beijing. China's economy is now being powered by their local people, the local economy. This might be great for China, but if you're an export nation without a huge population base with money, you are screwed. In a story from Bloomberg, China's strong GDP report shows housing remains a big problem. Retail sales figures have beaten expectations and China's jobless rate has fallen. This sounds great, right? China can save the world by consuming everything, right? They'll fly to Paris to buy handbags or buy stuff made in America. But let me destroy your hopes with this next chart. This shows China's consumption growth. China's still in a positive, well over 5%. However, this growth is driven by domestic consumption in orange and not from their exports. In fact, China's net exports in blue are dropping. It has gone negative for 2 consecutive quarters. Global demand for Chinese goods is also dropping. China's economy is now being powered domestically and relying less on exports to the West. In other words, China is at best self-sustaining and their imports are now becoming stagnant as well. Here's a chart of China's global imports. China's still buying stuff from the world, but if you look carefully at the trend of Chinese imports, there is zero growth over the past year. In fact, China's imports have dropped by $30 billion a month since the peak in 2021. They are buying less stuff from other economies. Sure, Chinese economy isn't collapsing, but they can't save the day either. We are witnessing a global collapse in demand. Now that I've taken Chinese demand out of the picture, let's talk about the US economy because it's not looking good for our best friend, President Biden. He's running on the economy, right? Remember Bidenomics? Well, I have bad news for that Martian School of Economics. Consumption in the United States will eventually collapse as well. The latest CEO to bash Bidenomics is Citadel's Ken Griffin. He is saying the obvious that the American public knows things aren't working in this economy for them. And let's unpack this mess. Here's why US consumer spending is collapsing. In America, domestic consumption is the main driver of economic growth. Yes, that includes government and military spending as well. You have to factor in the military industrial complex into this. According to the Federal Reserve, domestic spending accounts for 68% of US GDP. If that collapses further, so does the US economy. And this is where we need to focus on the household debt burden. The deeper people are in debt, the less spending power they have. If you get squeezed enough on all those monthly payments, you'll cut back on everything. Your discretionary spending and even your grocery spending will drop like a rock. And we can see both housing and non-housing debt has exploded up since the start of 2022. The rise in interest rates is having a deadly effect on mortgage payments and every single loan out there in the market. There's over $17 trillion worth of household debt in the system. Remember, we are in a debt-based economy. One person's debt is another person's revenue. If the debt becomes too much, households could delay payments or even default. And what's terrifying is the amount of credit card and auto loan debt households have. Credit card alone is over $1 trillion strong. People are taking on more debt just to survive. Interest rates on credit cards are well above 25% today. The longer it stays there, the higher the odds of a default, which will just smash the banking sector even further. There's now an indicator that's sending alarm bells ringing. It is called the sum rule, and it's predicted every recession without fail, and it has to do with unemployment. According to the rule, if the 3-month average of the unemployment rate is 0.5% more than its low a year ago, the economy is in recession. And I'll make it simpler to understand. The unemployment rate has risen to 3.9% today, and in February, it has hit a low of 3.4%. So if unemployment stays at 3.9% or goes higher for 3 more months, we are in a recession. This is a perfect leading indicator. It kind of makes sense. The longer unemployment stays high, especially when interest rates are elevated and inflation isn't solved, consumer spending is going to crater. It isn't rocket science. When enough people lose their jobs for a long enough period, they go broke. They won't have enough money to spend. And what pushes an economy addicted to cheap money off a cliff? It's high interest rates, higher borrowing costs that persist for too long. And because of government spending that's getting worse, we could reach the financial apocalypse by 2024. And this is where we need to connect the dots. The US government has a spending problem. No one can deny this anymore. In Q4 this year, Janet Yellen is going to borrow $776 billion. And in Q1 next year, she's going to borrow another $816 billion to fund the government. This is not sustainable because Yellen is issuing new bonds at higher interest rates. And the bigger the debt becomes, the more she needs to borrow, which forces bond yields to remain high. In a story from Bloomberg, US debt interest bill rockets past a cool $1 trillion a year. But this is going to get worse. The debt that was issued in 2020 during the lockdowns has to be refinanced at higher interest rates. Just look at the hockey stick rise. This is just the interest payments alone. This is where Congress is trapped. No matter what decision Biden makes, the US economy might already be screwed. Let's say he decides to continue deficit spending to prop up the economy. That means a continued tsunami of bonds that will pummel the economy. And if Biden decides to cut government spending, then domestic consumption will come crashing down as well. And this is what happens when you run an economy based on endless borrowing and interest rates suddenly start to rise. However, it gets messier. America is now funding two wars, one in Ukraine and the other in the Middle East. Over $100 billion have been given to Zelensky so far, and Joe Biden is looking for 100 billion more. It might be very distasteful, but war spending directly contributes to GDP. This is the reality of the US economy. Defense spending boosts US economy with the fastest rise since 2019. Defense expenditures have risen by almost 5% in the year through September. Unlike consumer spending, defense spending is inelastic. That means when you need to spend, you need to spend, no matter how high interest rates are today. War spending has increased by 4.9% so far, and if the Israel war erupts, we could see this shoot up to 10% or even 15%, and that will help skyrocket US GDP for the next few quarters. In fact, defense spending accounted for a fifth of GDP growth in Q1 this year. But this state of affairs can't continue forever because this funding is still coming from borrowed money. There's already waning demand for US treasuries. The last 30-year auction was a disaster, with yields rising across the board. So if Yellen continues to issue bonds for Biden, this will keep the cost of borrowing elevated. But if she doesn't borrow money to fund Congress, government spending is gonna crash and GDP will start falling as well. The only way to escape this dilemma is for the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. However, Jerome Powell is trapped. If he tries to pivot now and miscalculates, inflation will soar back up and he'll look like the biggest moron in history. Looking at the CPI and core inflation together, the drop is not convincing enough. Even the official numbers are well above the Fed's target of 2%. Core inflation is at 4% while headline is at 3.2%. So we can expect Powell to keep it there for longer. He won't hike, but neither will he cut until inflation comes down more. My guess is core inflation needs to crash below 3.5%. The headline figure also needs to drop below 3% before we can really talk about rate cuts. And when we zoom out and consider the whole picture, it is not looking good. Global demand is dropping across the board. Whether it's Japan, Europe, or China, consumer demand just isn't there. The US economy isn't invincible either. It's just a big game of chicken with the Federal Reserve. The longer they hold rates higher, the more they will destroy household spending. And if the Middle East war escalates, this adds even more upwards pressure to bond yields and squeezes consumers even more. The lag effect is manifesting and the odds for a global recession are growing fast. The Federal Reserve is still warning of more rate hikes if inflation doesn't slow down. That's even after the good CPI numbers, which tells us people are still too optimistic. Yes, financial conditions have indeed tightened. Real interest rates are above 2% and we are now in restrictive territory. This is the most restrictive in 16 years. But as we have said, the Federal Reserve is trapped. They will likely hold higher for longer because government spending isn't coming down. But the more Congress keeps spending, bond yields will continue to stay high or even increase. And this is something that Powell can't control, so he can only watch inflation. He has told us that he's afraid of inflation head fakes, and his mandate is to keep prices stable and unemployment still looks manageable here. Powell will continue to squeeze consumers to make sure he doesn't look like a clown. So we have to prepare because the US economy is looking really shaky, and when this big domino falls over, the rest of the world will crash as well. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Is the US economy immune to a recession? Or is 2024 the year of reckoning? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.